Bermuda, 1730. In the silence of a colonial kitchen, Sarah Bassett crushed leaves into powder. To her masters, it looked like spice. In truth, it was poison. Her quiet attempt to turn a simple meal into an act of vengeance. In the 18th century, Bermuda was a jewel in Britain's Atlantic crown. But beneath the surface of coral reefs and turquoise waters lay a system built on cruelty. This small island colony was a place of sharp contrasts, whitewashed houses and narrow lanes above, sweat and despair below. For the African-descended men and women forced into bondage, Bermuda was not paradise. It was a prison without walls, a place where the salt air mixed with the smell of whipped leather. The colony's economy thrived on maritime trade, shipbuilding, and household labor. Enslaved Africans, many captured from the West African coast or born into servitude on the island, were made to serve in the homes of wealthy colonists. They cooked meals, tended gardens, built ships, and hauled water, their lives dictated by the demands of others. Every gesture, every word, was measured against a backdrop of surveillance. Even in laughter, they could never forget the eyes that watched them. Sarah Bassett lived within this suffocating order. She was forced to serve in the household of a white family, tasked with endless chores that reinforced her invisibility. To her masters, she was nothing more than another piece of property, useful only when she worked, disposable if she resisted. To live in such a state was to carry humiliation like a second skin. But under the surface of submission, resentment simmered. The brutality of colonial life left scars too deep to ignore. Every insult, every denial of dignity, every moment of hunger while others feasted became kindling for quiet rage. Sarah, like many of her peers, understood that there was no court to hear her grievances, no law to protect her. Justice belonged exclusively to the colonists, and so she began to imagine what it would mean to seize justice for herself. She did not hold a sword or musket. She had no army behind her. What she did have was knowledge, small, secret knowledge passed down through whispers. She knew the wild plants that grew along the island's edges. She knew their roots and their bitter leaves. And she knew that inside the kitchen, surrounded by fire and food, power could change hands. In the darkness of Bermuda, Sarah Bassett's resolve began to take shape. She would not wait for freedom to be granted. If chains defined her life, perhaps poison could redefine her death or theirs. The kitchen was Sarah's domain, though she did not choose it. Day after day, she tended to the fire, stirred pots, chopped herbs, and baked bread for people who scarcely acknowledged her existence. Yet, within those walls, filled with heat and smoke, she discovered the one form of authority she could exercise. For the colonists, food was comfort and certainty. Meals connected them to England, to civilization, to their imagined superiority. But for Sarah, every ladle of broth and pinch of seasoning represented something else entirely, an opportunity. The kitchen, overlooked and ordinary, was her battlefield. The tools were simple, a mortar and pestle worn smooth by years of grinding, wooden spoons darkened with use, stone pots bubbling over the flames. Yet these humble instruments became weapons in her hands. With each motion, Sarah rehearsed a ritual older than Bermuda itself, the alchemy of survival. She knew which herbs could soothe a cough, and which could cause stomachs to twist in agony. She knew the difference between healing and harm, and she was prepared to cross that line. The island's soil was thin, its vegetation sparse, but Sarah's eyes had learned to find what others ignored. She gathered roots from roadside ditches, plucked leaves from scrubby bushes, and carried them home concealed in her apron folds. To her masters, they were weeds. To her, they were possibilities, silent allies in a struggle no one dared name. Inside the kitchen, she crushed the leaves with deliberate slowness. The sound of stone against stone echoed faintly, like a heartbeat beneath the surface of daily routine. A pinch of powder here, a bitter stem there. She studied the cauldron as if it were an oracle. One day, its contents would become the vehicle of her vengeance. What drove her was not reckless anger, but a cold, sharpened conviction. Years of subservience had stripped her of illusions. She understood the risk. Discovery meant torture, humiliation, and death. But in a life already hemmed in by chains, fear had lost its teeth. Better to act and risk everything than to wither in silence. To outsiders, She was only a servant moving quietly between the hearth and the table. But within her heart, Sarah Bassett was crafting something far greater, a declaration hidden in plain sight. Each flame that licked the pot, each bitter leaf ground into dust, was a step closer to rewriting the script imposed upon her. In the kitchen, she was not just a servant, she was a conspirator, a strategist, and perhaps, in her own eyes, a kind of executioner cloaked in apron and smoke. The island of Bermuda was small, but its shadows were deep. In those shadows, Sarah Bassett began to gather what she needed. She walked along the dusty lanes with her head bowed, feigning obedience, while her eyes searched the ground. Roots coiled beneath scrubby plants. Leaves with veins like scars fluttered in the salty wind. These were the ingredients of her rebellion. Knowledge like hers did not come from books. It came from memory, from fragments of African wisdom carried across the ocean, whispered in kitchens and fields. To the colonists, these plants were useless weeds. To Sarah, they were keys that unlocked suffering, weakness, or death. She crushed the roots between her fingers, feeling their bitterness seep into her skin. Each evening, as the house grew quiet, Sarah returned to the kitchen. She placed her finds into the mortar and began to grind. The rhythmic pounding was muffled by the crackle of the fire, blending into the sounds of domestic labor. She moved with precision, her face calm, her motions unremarkable, but in her mind, the plan unfolded step by step. The stew pot would be the vessel, the water jug, the carrier. Into them she would slip the powder, so subtle it would pass unnoticed. A spoonful here, a sip there, and the family that owned her would feel the poison's sting. Weakness would creep into their bodies, confusion into their minds. And in that vulnerability, Sarah would see her revenge. She knew she could not strike openly. She had no weapons but these. Poison was the only equalizer between a powerless servant and the people who commanded her life. It was her language of defiance, her declaration that she was more than property. In the quiet hours, she imagined the moment. The family seated at their table, laughter bouncing off the walls, unaware that the meal before them carried another meaning. They would taste broth and bread, but beneath the flavor, there would be bitterness. The bitterness of every lash, every insult, every stolen breath Sarah had endured. Still, she understood the danger. A slip of the hand, a rumor whispered, a single suspicious cough at the wrong moment could expose everything. But she pressed forward, because the alternative was silence, and silence was unbearable. In the shadows of Bermuda, a woman sharpened her defiance not with blades or fire, but with powder and roots. The plot was set. The only question was whether fate would allow it to unfold. The day came like any other, with the sun rising pale over the Atlantic and the household stirring to life. But for Sarah, it was a day years in the making. She moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, her hands steady, her heart steady too. The moment she had envisioned was here. The pot simmered, filling the air with the scent of herbs and salt. To an outsider, it was the smell of nourishment, of ordinary domestic labor. To Sarah, it was the smell of reckoning. She stirred slowly, making sure the bitter powder dissolved into the broth. In the jug of water nearby, another portion of her mixture waited. When the time came, the food was carried to the table. Plates were filled, bowls passed. The family leaned forward, laughing lightly, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Sarah stood nearby, hands folded, eyes lowered in practiced humility. But inside, she was watching every movement, every spoon lifted to a mouth, every sip taken from the jug. With each swallow, her defiance grew louder in her own mind. These were not just meals, they were judgments. Every bite was a reminder that power was not absolute, that even a woman bound in chains could bend destiny to her will. The kitchen servant had become an unseen arbiter, tipping the scales of justice in a world where justice had been denied. Her pulse quickened as she waited for signs. A cough, a grimace, a pause at the strange bitterness. Would the poison take hold? Would the masters feel the weakness she had so carefully planned? In those tense moments, Sarah Bassett was no longer invisible. In her own eyes, she was transformed from servant to avenger, from voiceless to powerful. But the climax was fragile, balanced on the edge of discovery. A child at the table wrinkled a nose, pushed the bowl away. A murmur rose. Something tastes different. The fragile veil that had shielded her act began to tremble. Suspicion flickered like a candle flame, threatening to expose everything. Yet even as doubt spread across the room, Sarah did not flinch. She kept her stance, silent and unreadable. The act had been done. Whether it ended in triumph or downfall, she had crossed the line that could never be uncrossed. In that instant, the kitchen, once her prison, became her stage. The climax of her defiance was not only in the poison she served, but in the courage to serve it at all. The plan unraveled not with a shout, but with a whisper. A child at the table, sensitive to flavors adults might dismiss, tasted the broth and froze. The spoon clattered back into the bowl. A wrinkle of disgust crossed the young face, and soon the words came, "This doesn't taste right." In that moment, a small suspicion spread like wildfire. One comment led to another. The family sniffed, sipped again, frowned. There was a bitterness that did not belong, a sharp edge that no English herb could explain. Confusion gave way to fear, and fear, in such households, always needed a culprit. Eyes turned toward the kitchen, toward the woman who had stirred the pot, toward Sarah. She stood in silence, her hands steady, but the weight of suspicion pressed down like a storm cloud. It did not take long for the whispers to grow into accusations. The search began almost immediately. Servants combed through the kitchen, overturning jars, examining bowls, lifting lids, and there, hidden among the utensils, they found the incriminating roots and leaves the very plants Sarah had ground into dust. To the colonists, these were not herbs of healing or tradition. They were evidence, proof of malicious intent. The house filled with murmurs, a rising tide of panic and outrage. Poison was not just an attack on a single family, it was, in the colonial mind, an attack on order itself. If one enslaved woman could strike at her masters from within their own home, then no household was safe. The discovery of Sarah's plot became more than a personal betrayal. It became a symbol of defiance, and the colonists would not allow it to stand. She was seized quickly, her arms bound, her body dragged into the open like contraband revealed. Neighbors gathered, drawn by the scent of scandal. The news spread from street to street, carried by fear. A woman has tried to poison her masters. Sarah did not beg, nor did she protest. Her silence was louder than words, and in that silence, people projected their own fears and interpretations. Some whispered that she had confessed in spirit by refusing to deny it. Others claimed her silence was arrogance, a final act of defiance against the authority that claimed her. By the time the authorities arrived, the verdict was already written in the minds of the colonists. Sarah Bassett, the quiet woman of the kitchen, had crossed a line that could not be ignored. The truth, once exposed, left no room for mercy. The trial was held swiftly, as was customary in colonies eager to make examples. Sarah was marched into a room where the air smelled of ink and parchment, where wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of officials and townspeople alike. She stood alone before the colonial council, her wrists bound, her face lit by shafts of sunlight cutting through shuttered windows. The accusations were clear: attempted murder by poison. To the white colonists, it was a crime beyond comprehension. Poison was feared not only for its physical effects, but for its secrecy. It slipped past defenses, betrayed trust, and struck from within. To accuse a servant of such an act was to paint her as both traitor and monster. One by one, witnesses stepped forward. The child who first tasted the bitterness, the adults who confirmed the strange flavor, the servants who uncovered the roots and leaves in the kitchen. Each testimony piled upon the last, building a mountain of guilt in the eyes of the council. Sarah was questioned, pressed, and prodded for words that would absolve or condemn her. Yet she offered little. No desperate plea, no elaborate defense. Her silence unsettled the room more than any denial could have. It gave the impression of certainty, of a woman who had weighed her choices and accepted their cost. The counselors, men steeped in the laws of empire, had no interest in the complexities of her life. They did not ask what cruelties she had endured, what indignities had carved her path to this moment. They cared only for the preservation of order. To them, Sarah Bassett represented a threat larger than herself. If one enslaved woman could dare to strike at her masters, what would stop others from doing the same? The verdict came quickly. The council declared her guilty of attempted murder by poison, a capital crime. The sentence, death by hanging, carried out publicly as a warning to all who might consider rebellion. For the colonists, justice had been served. For Sarah, justice had never existed. The trial was not about her guilt or innocence. It was about reaffirming power, stamping out even the suggestion that the enslaved could resist. When the session ended, the townspeople filed out, buzzing with fear and fascination. Sarah was led away in chains, her face still calm, her lips still sealed. She had not begged, she had not broken. And in that defiance, however quiet, she left a mark deeper than any verdict could erase. The words of the council fell like iron, death by hanging. The chamber was silent for a heartbeat, and then murmurs rose, confirming what everyone had expected. For the colonists, the punishment was less about Sarah Bassett herself, and more about the message it would send. Fear had to be contained, and order had to be restored. Sarah stood motionless as the sentence was read aloud. She did not cry, did not plead for mercy. Her silence unsettled those in the room, as though she had chosen to deny them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not give them tears. She would not grant them the appearance of defeat. In colonial Bermuda, executions were not private matters. They were spectacles, orchestrated to remind the enslaved population of their vulnerability and to reassure the colonists of their dominance. The council decreed that Sarah's hanging would take place in Street George's, before a gathered crowd. Her death would not simply be punishment, it would be theater. For enslaved men and women across the island, the news of her sentence spread quickly. Some felt terror, their spirits weighed down by the inevitability of violence. Others felt something more complicated, a grim respect for the woman who had dared to strike back. To attempt poisoning was to wield knowledge, to use the only power available to her. Even in failure, Sarah had forced the colony to see her not as property, but as a threat. Preparations for the execution moved forward with bureaucratic efficiency. The gallows was readied, the rope inspected, the date fixed. Officials spoke of deterrence, of the need to crush rebellion before it spread. Yet beneath their words was an undercurrent of unease. If one enslaved woman could nearly topple a household from within, who could say what others might do? Sarah was kept in custody, watched day and night. The cell was cold, the air thick with the scent of damp stone. But if despair gnawed at her, she did not show it. To those who saw her, she appeared calm, composed, even resigned. Perhaps she understood that her fate was sealed the moment the roots were discovered. Perhaps she found strength in the knowledge that her defiance had not gone unnoticed. The sentence of death was meant to erase her. But in truth, it marked the beginning of her transformation into something larger than herself, a symbol of defiance, carried in whispers among the enslaved long after the council had spoken its final words. The 21st of June, 1730. The morning sun rose pale and unforgiving over Street George's. The town stirred with anticipation, its narrow streets filling with people summoned by curiosity, fear, or duty. Public executions were community rituals, binding colonists together in the spectacle of power. For the enslaved, it was a forced lesson, a warning carved into the air. The gallows stood in stark silhouette against the sky, its timber beams rough but unyielding. The rope dangled, swaying slightly in the sea breeze, a grim reminder of what was to come. Soldiers and officials arranged themselves with practiced formality, ensuring the crowd could see the event unfold. Sarah Bassett was brought forward, escorted by guards. Chains clinked softly at her wrists and ankles, but her steps were steady. Those who expected to see fear on her face found instead an unsettling calm. She walked not as a woman broken, but as someone who had already chosen her path. In the crowd, enslaved men and women stood shoulder to shoulder with their owners, their eyes lowered, yet their hearts alive with unspoken words. They had been forced to attend, to witness the consequences of defiance. But within the silence, some carried a flicker of admiration. Sarah was one of them, and she had dared to resist. The executioner adjusted the rope, his hands efficient, his expression indifferent. Sarah mounted the wooden steps, each creak of the platform echoing in the tense stillness. When the noose was placed around her neck, she did not cry out. She did not beg. Her lips remained closed, her eyes steady, as though she refused to acknowledge the spectacle. A hush fell over the crowd. Time seemed to pause. For a moment, the colonists saw not a servant, but a woman standing tall against the machinery of empire. For a moment, the enslaved saw not doom, but defiance embodied. The signal was given. The crowd gasped, the rope tightened, and Sarah Bassett's body hung suspended in the morning air. The execution was swift, her silence preserved until the very end. When it was over, the colonists exhaled relief, believing they had restored order. But among the enslaved, something lingered. They would remember not the rope, but the image of Sarah standing tall, refusing to break. On that June morning, the gallows claimed her body, but the act of defiance, carried out in a kitchen and sealed on the scaffold, became part of the island's memory, a quiet resistance that no rope could erase. When the crowd dispersed from Street George's that morning, the official narrative was clear. Justice had been served, rebellion crushed, order restored. Yet history does not live only in proclamations. It lives in whispers, in stories carried from mouth to mouth. And in those whispers, Sarah Bassett lived on. Among the colonists, her name became a cautionary tale. Parents told their children of the kitchen servant who tried to poison her masters. Ministers preached that sin and disobedience could only end in death. The gallows became a symbol, not only of punishment but of fear, the fear that those forced to serve might strike back when least expected. But among the enslaved, the memory was different. For them, Sarah was not simply a criminal. She was a reminder that power was never absolute, that even in the confines of a kitchen, resistance was possible. They repeated her story in hushed tones, how she gathered the leaves, how she stirred the pot, how she walked to the gallows without a word of surrender. To them, her silence spoke louder than any sermon. In the fields, around the hearth, in the quiet hours when the masters slept, the tales circulated. Each retelling carried a spark of defiance, a lesson that the bonds of slavery could not extinguish the will to resist. Even if her attempt failed, it proved that courage could exist in the most ordinary spaces. Over time, Sarah Bassett's act became part of the island's hidden history, a story not written in official records, but in the collective memory of those who longed for freedom. She had not killed her masters, but she had poisoned something more enduring, the illusion of unquestioned control. For the enslaved, her death was not just a warning, it was a symbol. Every pot stirred afterward carried a trace of her defiance. Every bitter herb tasted faintly of her rebellion. She became less a person than a presence unseen but remembered, erased but enduring. The colonists had hoped her execution would end the matter. Instead, it gave her story permanence. Sarah Bassett, once an invisible servant, became a name passed down like contraband, a forbidden memory that refused to die. In Bermuda, the waves still broke on coral shores, ships still came and went. Life continued as before, but beneath it all, her whispers remained, carried in the hearts of those who knew that even silence could resist. Sarah Bassett did not succeed in killing her masters. What she killed was silence. Her act, born in a kitchen of smoke and bitterness, forced a question that still lingers. When justice is absent, is resistance itself a crime? Her grave bears no marker. Her name lies outside official chronicles. Yet in every retelling, she endures like a drop of poison seeping into history, impossible to erase.